It's a great privilege to welcome back this afternoon Professor Nidhal Guessoum, who's a professor of physics from the University of Charlotte in the United Arab Emirates. And Nidhal has actually spoken very widely in the whole field of science religion, has written a wonderful book that's already out in French, and we hope to see it out in English as well in the near future. And we're delighted he's now speaking in the second of this two-part series, and this time he's going to address much more the question of Islam and science today. Thank you, Professor Guessoum.
Thank you, Dennis. It's again a delight to be here with you and to be speaking to this wonderful audience. We've had a day and a half of interactions and discussions. I think we're pretty much done with the history now. I think this is the border between the past and the present. We've covered the history, medieval Europe yesterday afternoon, early modern period this morning, the Islamic period in the past yesterday afternoon, etc. And now I think the group is ready to start looking at today. What are the issues today? It is, I think, by chance that the Islamic world is being looked at, or I'm going to look at it first. And I'm going to try to be as objective and as honest as I can and to really address present-day issues. We're going to look at what are the sticking items, including creationism, evolution, etc., the scriptures, modern science, discoveries, methodology, and so forth. And also to look at the state of science. How is science really looked at, perceived, practiced? To what extent has it seeped into the culture of the Islamic world today as opposed to the past? So I think it will be, I hope it's going to be an interesting presentation, because it will force us to really look at the interaction of science and religion in one particular context, the Islamic society of today. But it will have repercussions, as we've been discussing. There are many parallels between what you will hear today and some other situations like the evangelical Christian community in the States and other places. I have subtitled this presentation of Islam and Science today, From Discord to Harmony, for two reasons. One is to set the tone from the beginning that I believe and I will show that there is presently quite a bit of discord, contrary to what many people will claim. If you talk to thinkers, leaders, teachers, etc., science and Islam, they will say there is no problem between Islam and science. The Quran, as I mentioned yesterday, is very encouraging towards science. Our Muslim predecessors were great scholars. They did wonderful astronomy and medicine and algebra and trigonometry, etc., etc. So why do you think there is a problem? But I think if we probe a little bit, if we look, if we practice science as I have done for the past at least 15 years in the Arab Muslim world, then we uncover there is quite a bit of discord. But at the same time, as much as I am an objective and honest person, thinker, teacher, and I tend to look at the data at the ground and what is the situation and really address the issues, I also want to be a constructive person. I always want to rebuild. I do want to bring down whatever misconceptions, whatever erroneous claims are being made, but at the same time it is not enough to just criticize or to just point out the errors. So at the end I will have my own proposal for harmony, for how these things could mesh, and it is my hope and contention that it is also applicable outside of the Islamic world. Here's the outline again, just to tell you where we're going or what we're going to cover. Science in the Muslim world today, science as a practice, as a field of endeavor, as research, as learning, etc., but also science in the culture of the Muslim world. So I'll spend maybe 1/3 of the presentation trying to sort of examine, survey the field and the culture, the society. Then I will look directly to the evolution creationism problem in today's Muslim society, because as I said, we want to look at the real issues, the real problems. I don't want to be overly negative, at least I try not to be overly negative, so I will try to also point out some positive signs in the context of science in the Muslim world. Then I will look at what I call the serious science-Islam discourse, which has developed over the past 20, 30 years, has has tended to subside in the past decade or so. I will point out the leaders of the people who tried to present their own viewpoints, perspectives, proposals as to how science and Islam could be harmonized or meshed, or which takes precedent, or how to integrate one into the other, or separate, or whatever. And after that, I will present my own harmonizing proposal, what I call the spirit of Averroes. Conclusions at the end. Let's start looking at how science fares today in the Muslim world. There will be 3 items in this. The first one is what I call, to be very honest, dismal scientific production and activity. Let me just give you some depressing news. Out of about 2,000 universities in the Muslim world, few are in the top 500 in the world. If you look at the top 500 listings, there are different listings now, some from the UK, some from the US, from China, etc. Top 500 universities in the world rated by scientific production, by library holdings, activity, etc. You find very, very few, maybe counted on the fingers of one hand, that are from the Muslim world, and those that are in the top 500 are all between 400 and 500, meaning there are none that are in the top 400. So that's first indication. Number 2, if you look at the number of scientific publications originating in the Muslim world, papers published in international journals, they represent about 1.1% of the world production today in any typical year. To give just an example of patents, for example, in 1999, only 134 patents were registered in the whole Muslim region. This, just to give a reference or a comparative figure, if you compare it with Israel, for example, in Israel there were over 3,000 patents registered in that year, compared to the whole Muslim world, which encompasses about 1.2 to 1.4 billion people, compared to Israel, which has like 7 million people. Number of frequently cited scientific papers per million people is 0.02 in Egypt, 0.07 in Saudi Arabia, 0.01 in my country Algeria, 0.53 in Kuwait, and then if you want to compare, you look at Israel, for example, and it's 38, meaning it's several orders of magnitude above, about 1,000 times higher or so, 43 in the US, 80 in Switzerland, etc. So in terms of scientific production, in terms of scientific research, if we consider science as a human activity, production of science, research, learning, the Muslim world is not doing well, to put it mildly. B, science education. How is science education doing in the Muslim world? Let me just give you again just some flashes to tell you how the situation looks. Dismal performances by almost all the Muslim states this is just to take one example. TIMSS 2007. TIMSS is the so-called Trends in International Mathematics and Science study. It's a voluntary international examination where states register their students and say, we want to participate. And so this international examination, which is held every 3 years, goes to different countries, takes few hundred students, give them a standard exam. In math and in science, grade 4 and grade 8. And then they score them, and it takes about a year of statistics, etc., and then the numbers are released. The latest numbers, which were from 2007, were only released about 8 months ago or so. And they show that, for example, I'm just focusing on science, leaving math on the side, but it's pretty much the same level. In grade 8 science, for example, 8 of the bottom 9 countries were Muslim ones. The number of countries that participated in this latest round was, I think, in math about 35 or so, and in science 45, or vice versa, something like that. Recent international surveys of students at various levels, from high school to university to even professors, regarding the question of evolution. I will have a lot more data to present to you in a moment. With teachers either not teaching it or stating clearly that they don't believe it. Meaning that when they surveyed attitudes and beliefs of students regarding evolution, students and teachers it was found that either it was not taught at all because it wasn't in the curriculum, or it was in the curriculum so people were forced to teach it, so they would teach it but tell people that we don't really believe this stuff, it's just in the curriculum so we have to do it, or they present it in a very erroneous manner. And there will be more data on this later. Third component of this general survey of the situation of science in the Muslim world today is this very popular trend nowadays. There are dozens, hundreds of books, documentaries, TV shows, interviews, lectures, etc., on the, quote, scientific content in the Quran. What is this? Let me just, again, give you just some flashes, just so you see what is the situation out there. And then we will look at how to remedy that. In March 2008, so this is just about a year ago, there was the 9th conference. This is not just one crazy episode somewhere. The 9th conference on scientific miraculous content in the Quran, held in Algeria, in my own country, under the patronage of the president himself, and organized by the World Authority on Miraculous Science in the Quran. So there's a World Authority, an agency that organizes these things. Every 2 years or so, it organizes a major international conference. It's usually highly sponsored, etc. So in 2008, it was in Algeria. In 2006, it was in Kuwait, held in the Sheraton Hotel, etc. Next year, it's going to be in Turkey for Dennis's information, and so on and so forth. Now, let me give you just some highlights or quotes of what was said there, or what was presented. The Prime Minister of that time, who has been replaced now, not for this reason, for other political reasons, opened the conference and said, many researchers and scientists have ended up admitting that many of their discoveries and inventions in fact exist in the Quran. This is an exact quote from his opening speech. The papers, quote unquote, that were presented, there were many of them, included, for example, the miracle in the therapy by honey, hydrogen cell energy anticipated by the verse of the light. And I have reproduced here the verse of the light, which is one of the most sublime verses in the Quran, talking about God as a light of the heavens and the earth, etc. And where somebody, for the life of me, I cannot understand how he inferred that. But from this verse, which I'll just read very quickly, God is the light of the heavens and the earth. A likeness of his light is as a niche in which is a lamp. The lamp is in a glass, and the glass is, as it were, a brightly shining star lit from a blessed olive tree. Highly metaphorical thing. People have written, pages and pages to try to interpret all of this. Somebody found hydrogen cell energy in this. Continued scientific content. In December 2006, as I said, there was the 8th conference, the previous one, in Kuwait. And again, 86 papers were presented in parallel sessions on topics that included, just to give you again some ideas, the miracle in the descent of iron from the sky, the scientific miracle in the Quran's description of the movement of shadows. I'm a physicist, I don't even know what the movement of shadows, let alone the immobile shadow, what that means. The superiority of the treatment of lower backs by prayers over the treatment by lasers. The scientific miracle in the prophetic statement regarding remedying by vinegar. These are papers. Now, the other big contentious issue, and this is not exclusive to the Islamic society of today, is evolution/creationism. Let me give you again some data. I like to start with data and then sort of build and try to find answers to that. This is from a paper that was published in December 2008 in Science, that prime journal, where Salman Hamid reported on the results of surveys on evolutionary/creationist attitudes in 6 different countries from the Muslim world. Those countries were Kazakhstan, Turkey, Indonesia, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Egypt. The numbers here show you how many respondents there were, so the statistical significance of this. I copied this from the paper itself. I would have put the green here as red because the green here is supposed to represent could not possibly be true regarding the theory of evolution. I wouldn't have put that in green. What is here in sort of orange-brown over here is people who accept the theory of evolution. So as you can see, except for Kazakhstan, which of course has a legacy from the Soviet Union, etc., is a special case. All the others basically have between 10 and 20% of acceptance of the theory of evolution. Over here, it's between 50 and 60% of total rejection, could not possibly be true. And then in the middle over here is either probably false, the black stuff, or the purple, which is supposed to say, I really don't know because I haven't thought or read enough about it. So if you consider those who rejected, it's somewhere between 60 and 70%. Those who don't know is about 10 to 15%, and those who accept it somewhere between 10 and 20%. There's a total fixation with human evolution. I mean, the reason why there is this big blockage with the theory of evolution is because of human evolution. There's near unanimous rejection of the idea that humans could have evolved from earlier species, and we'll come back to this. Some of you may have heard of Harun Yahya, who is a Turkish leader who has a big website, harunyahya.org, I think, or .com or something, has published, according to him, about 450 books under his name. Apparently he has a whole bunch of people working under him, and they produce stuff, and it always appears under his name. And he has tons of DVDs and CDs, etc., including the famous Atlas of Creation, which was mailed around. I don't know if it was mailed here in the UK, but it was...
We've all got it.
You all got it. So it was mailed to high schools in France and in Switzerland, and it caused an uproar in Belgium, etc., where sometimes the Minister of Education had to intervene and forbid or outlaw the usage of that book because it was going to pollute people's minds and so forth. But it is totally creationist, totally anti-evolutionary, but the tons of money and resources that this person and organization has is creating such a huge impact, as I will mention a little bit later, including in the country where I live, in the United Emirates, where about 2 years ago I was shocked to open up the weekend paper and find a big story with a big title of Origins of Life or something, and I said, Origins of Life, let me take a look at that. And then suddenly, the subtitle underneath it was, Theory of Evolution to be removed next year from grade 12. I said, So I read that, and it was the effects or the results of the campaign by the Harun Yahya followers in the United Arab Emirates. So it has had some impact. Let me give you now some more results on that recent international survey of high school students. It's a large project, the results of which only started to appear in, I think, March of this year, only a few months ago. 5,500 Muslim high school students in Canada, because it is hosted at McGill University in collaboration with, I think there's an American university that participates in this. I'm not sure, but it is hosted at McGill. So that's why they looked at also Muslim students in Canada, but primarily Muslim students in Egypt, Lebanon, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Turkey. They had 150 interviews with Muslim scientists, teachers, and community members, and they had some teacher focus group discussions. Very quickly, the results now of what that showed. This is again just this year. More than 80% of students believe humans were created separately and in their present forms. As I said, it is the human evolution that really causes a problem. Teachers, though not seeing contradiction between Islam and science. So if you take them apart and you say, you don't mention evolution, you say, is there a problem between modern science and Islam? They say, of course not. Is there a problem between modern biology and Islam? They say, of course not. Of course not. Is there a problem between evolution and Islam? I don't know, it depends. Humans, and what do you mean by evolution, microevolution or macroevolution? And then you get into such issues. Teachers have flawed understanding of evolution. They reject human evolution and often include Quranic verses referring to creation. So they sort of try to counter the scientific curriculum that they are teaching by bringing up some Quranic verses which they think, at least superficial literalistic reading and understanding, supports a creationist scenario or viewpoint. 15 out of 18 Pakistani teachers rejected human evolution even though they were teaching it. Textbooks often present two viewpoints separately. So they will tell you, okay, here's what science says, and then here's what the Quran says, according to them. the Islamic concept of creation, the scientific concept of how life and humans appeared. Some teachers in evolution in Indonesia reported using material produced by Harun Yahya. So that tells you how the situation is actually worsening. Here's a survey of views on evolution that I did myself at my own university. Now, my own university is the American University in Sharjah, in the United Arab Emirates. The reason why I did this survey is because my university is a very nice social laboratory. It has about 5,000 students of over 70 nationalities. I would say maybe about 80% of them or so are Muslim, but there are many non-Muslims. And even among the Muslims, you have all kinds of diverse backgrounds from Pakistan, India, Iran, etc., but also from the whole Middle East and from Africa. But at the same time, we have about 350 faculty members, half of whom are non-Muslims, roughly, coming from the West, from the United States, from Canada, from Britain, from France, etc., and half of them are Arab Muslims. So it's a very good group to sort of go and explore. So I had a couple of students. I drew up a questionnaire with all kinds of issues, not just on evolution. I really wanted, for the book that Dennis mentioned, wanted to go and see what are the viewpoints and attitudes of people regarding science, religion issues. So I would ask them, for example, about the age of the earth, about the age of the universe, about miracles, about God's action in the world or in intervention. Do you believe that God acts in the world? Are disasters like earthquakes, etc., God's punishment? So I had all kinds of questions, but here I'm going to just focus on evolution. Here's the first set of questions. So here in this column is how Muslim students responded. Here's how Muslim professors responded. And here's how non-Muslim professors responded to these statements. So statement one is, evolution is just an unproven theory, I don't believe in it. About exactly the same figure, same numbers of Muslim students and Muslim professors said that, about 60%. This was the big revelation to me. It was like, so if you end up with a PhD in engineering or in whatever, or in architecture, it doesn't make any difference in the end. Evolution is correct except for humans, 28%, 22%. Evolution is strongly confirmed by evidence. This is the one I would put in green. And interestingly, about 11%, 14%, a very small minority of Muslim students and professors, whereas the non-Muslims, 74%. So in the United States, for example, or even in Europe, there are these surveys that show that the general population, especially in the States, largely rejects evolution. 50 to 60% are the general surveys, Gallup polls, and so forth. But when you do that among educated folks, of course, you do not find such high rejection of evolution, contrary to this situation. Here's another set of questions. Evolution is against religion. Here, what I was trying to look at in these three statements over here is whether people accepted the teaching of evolution, the idea of teaching evolution. So, first proposition is evolution is against religion, it should not be taught. 32%, 12%, 0% among non-Muslims. Then, evolution should be taught, but as just a theory, which of course people don't even understand what a theory means. When we say the theory of evolution, we really mean that it is now established. But for them, as a theory means like just as a proposition, as a hypothesis, as like your viewpoint, my viewpoint. So, if you're going to teach it as just a theory, they said, that's okay. So, 58%, 70%. Evolution should be taught as a strong theory, 17% over here, 19% over here, 64% among the non-Muslims. So clearly this is one of the big sticking issues. Enough depressing news, let's move on to maybe a little bit of positive signs, a few positive signs. I actually have lots of positive signs or a lot of information on that, but limited in time, so I have to limit myself to a few ideas. Women have made huge strides in Arab higher education, science, and research. I have all kinds of slides and data on this, but I don't have time to present this. But I could show you, for example, that even in conservative countries like Saudi Arabia, Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, etc., the percentage of women who go to the university, if you take a public university, the National Public University in Qatar, or the National Public University in Bahrain, and you look at what are the percentages of male, female. Normally, in most countries, it is something like 50-something to 40-something boys to girls, roughly. If you look at those countries, you will find 70 to 80% girls, 20 to 30% boys, generally. Now, if you look at science disciplines, go to chemistry major or physics major, you'll find again 70 to 80% girls, 20 to 30% boys. This is very recent data in the past 5 to 10 years. So clearly, the girls are being encouraged to go to university, to graduate, to go into the sciences. As I've always repeated, for now maybe 15 years, the president of Kuwait University has been a woman. In Qatar, highly conservative country, not as conservative as Saudi Arabia, but maybe second in conservativeness. For the past at least 5 years, the president of the university has been a woman. The dean of arts and sciences is a woman. The dean of the faculty of theology is a woman. So it gives you an idea. So there's some very positive signs, although there's some relativizing factors to be placed in there, but I can discuss that later if you like. There's the emergence in the past 3-4 years of new, well-endowed research funding agencies in the Gulf. There are now sort of NSF-style agencies in the Gulf, in the United Arab Emirates, in Qatar, and elsewhere, where people submit proposals, food proposals, they get sent to referees, and then there's discussion, evaluation, and funding at high levels, $100,000, things like this. So this bodes well for research and science. There's a large increase in university enrollments. There are, in the United Emirates now, where the total population is only about 6 million, 6.5. I counted once about a good half dozen full-fledged universities and another 20 or so institutes or colleges. So that tells you how much demand there is. And elsewhere, same, I could give a whole talk on universities and university formats and in the Gulf and in the Middle East. Large increases in research spending. How much money does the state put into research and development? Sometimes the Ministry of Higher Education and Research, sometimes a full-fledged Ministry of Research and Science, sometimes a sub-ministry, if you like, or an agency. The general average level of funding in the world is about 1% of GDP, gross domestic product. In well-developed countries, it's 2% or more. In the Arab Muslim world, the average is about, currently, has been for many years, about 0.2%. Very, very low. Even though many of them are very rich countries, but still the amount of money or the percentage of money that they put into research and development has been very, very low. Qatar, for example, has targeted by next year to reach 2.8%, which would be a very respectable percentage. It is not just Qatar, and it's not just these oil-rich countries. It has to do, to some extent, with the fact that the oil having reached $140 at some point, now back down to about $60, $70, these countries all of a sudden got much richer. So, for example, Algeria has already raised the spending to about 1% and has stated that it targets about 1.5% by 2015. Nigeria also has announced an increase, but all of these are sort of countries that have some money and have realized that, hey, we're in big trouble now unless we raise our funding of science. And the creation of science and technology parks, this one being the one in Qatar that was inaugurated just a few months ago. So there are some positive signs in terms of science, science practice, science education, etc., but there's still quite a bit to go. One last positive sign is this slow start of science activity in the media. Until very recently, we basically didn't have any Science Journalists Association. We had very few throughout the Arab world, for example, which has more than 300 million people. Very few, if any, science magazines. Documentaries now are coming to the fore because many places have opened up documentary channels. Al Jazeera, for example, has an Al Jazeera documentary channel, 24 hours, just devoted to documentaries. And so they buy lots of documentaries and dub them or subtitle them in Arabic, and they broadcast them. But until recently, it was very rare to find a real, up-to-date science documentary, science magazine, etc. So now, this is now beginning to change with the establishment of an Arab Science Journalists Association, established in 2006, even though when I checked, last I checked in their website, their financing was still under to be determined, meaning they don't have money. But still, they announced the winners of the first annual Arab Science Journalism Awards. This was in September of last year. They held their first conference in Fez, Morocco in October 2008. So there is clearly some development and some progress on that front. Let's now get to conceptual issues, really sort of more meta. I don't mean metaphysical as in, God and so forth, but at the higher level. What are the main philosophical issues in trying to relate science and Islam? How have people looked at that, and what do they say in terms of how to mesh one with the other, etc. In the 70s and 80s, there were three main schools that attempted to, quote, properly define the relation between Islam and science. And by the way, when I say science here, I mean modern science, the science that has appeared in the past few centuries. Sacred, meaning Islamic science, this is, and I will go back and present each one of these in a slide on its own, so I don't have to right away tell you in detail. But these are the three ones. One is known as the sacred science. So science should be placed under a sacred format and fused, and I will say in a moment how Sayyid Hussein Nasr is a philosopher of Iranian origin who has lived in the United States now for the past 30 years or so, very well known for many of his books. Anyway, I have some fundamental disagreements with him, but we can get to that later. Ethical science, Sardar, whom I mentioned yesterday, who is of Pakistani origin but has grown in this country and lives in the suburb of London, has written extensively on this, although in the past 10 years or so he has dealt with future issues and postmodernism and so forth. He hasn't been dealing with science so much, but he and his school, the Ijmalis, have developed this idea of an ethical science, developed a new approach to modern science that is fused with Islamic principles and would be an ethical type of science. We'll get to that in a second. And then there is Abdus Salam, the famous Pakistani Nobel Prize winner, the first Muslim Nobel Prize winner in physics, who insisted that science is universal, and that's that. So we'll get to that also in a moment. There are other voices, including this idea of science as a search of God, which is similar to what we heard this morning, that when you go to nature, basically what you are discovering is a channel toward God, or you're seeing God and His attributes and His wisdom and His love and His mercy, etc. This is Said Nursi, a long-dead Turkish thinker and preacher, has huge followers in Turkey and beyond. And then there is Mehdi Golshani, this contemporary Iranian thinker, physicist, who has PhD from Berkeley and is now sort of more of a philosophical physicist, who has argued that Islamic science is basically what you in the West would be calling theistic science. So we just add a theistic cloak or envelope to it, and we accept basically modern science minus its materialistic connotations, and that would be Islamic science. So let's look briefly at the above serious schools. Nasr, first of all, who is the most forceful, the most prominent, who has published the most on this, still speaks very forcefully, publishes almost every year, etc. This is Sayyid Hussein Nasr. Considers modern science as a human anomaly. So that just sets the tone for it. The reason why he considers it as a human anomaly is because he says this is the first time in our history as humans that we have developed a science that is disconnected from God, that puts God away. This is what we discussed yesterday as methodological naturalism. So he says this is a human anomaly, and for him, to summarize very briefly, this is just an episode in human history. He says, in a few decades or a few centuries, we will have forgotten this mistake, and we will go back to real science, which is sacred science, which is a fusion of theology, science, etc. So he says, this is why it produced all the major ills, and when you read his books, it's very gloomy, very depressing. Science is terrible. Science has debased man, has produced fragmentation in our lives. We are now broken into different disciplines, and our minds are, now in the morning I do science, and in the afternoon I have to run to pick up my children, and at night I have to pray, and the next day I do this, and it's a broken life, fragmentation, and disorder. He says, okay, we're all now going in separate directions, and we don't know what we're searching for, etc., etc. So there's a serious problem. He says, on the contrary, in the Islamic civilization, science considered nature as sacred. I personally dispute this, but this is what he says, that nature is sacred. Why is it sacred? Because, according to him, nature was one with the metaphysical. There is no such thing as physical and metaphysical in Nasr's viewpoint. For him, the angels and the spirits and gravity and light and humans and are all sort of interwoven in this cosmos and universe. And he says this is how the Muslims look at it before, which I don't think is true at all. And that's what he wants to go back to. Access to information can be by reason or by individual intuition, meaning, because he is very much Sufi inclined, mystically inclined, he says, reason and methodology, as we have argued, is modern science, is only one way of reaching truths. There are many truths, he says, that you can access by mystical exercises, by intuition, from your heart, not from your brain. So he says this is why we can reach certain viewpoints, etc. Rejects the objectives of modern science, all that what we consider as modern science, confirmation by repeatability, accuracy, falsification, and etc., peer review. All of this, he says, this is just a bunch of nonsense. He sees more importance in the values of purpose, meaning, beauty, harmony. He says this is what science should be about, not the process and the methodology that you claim is the core of modern science and the triumph of modern science. So this is sacred science according to Nasr, who I must insist, even though this may sound very surprising and perhaps even shocking to you, has large followers. There are many intellectuals who are really seduced by this kind of talk. It's mystical, it's sacred, it's unifying, and so forth. And it sounds Islamic. Second discourse type is this, again, Islamic science, and by that, which is a very different meaning, Sardar and his collaborators, this is Ziauddin Sardar, they mean ethical type of science. Their discourse, which was very prominent, they published quite a few books, they had conferences, etc. in the 70s and the 80s, focuses on the fact that modern science is, according to them, flawed and dangerous. From its metaphysical basis meaning this naturalism, materialism, etc., disconnecting God, putting him on the side, you cannot bring anything sacred into the picture. So he says, they say, this metaphysical base of modern science is a flaw, but all the way down to the social effects and technological applications, and when you read Sardar and when you listen to him, there's always this emphasis again on the environmental problems that we have created and caused. Some of the method he keeps repeating, for example, dissection, vivisection is his favorite one. They keep cutting down animals, and this is unethical, and this is what modern science, this is how modern science functions, etc. puts more importance in the social relevance of science than in its epistemological objectives. This is where I strongly disagree with him. He says science, in the Islamic framework, is any good knowledge about nature that produces social good, that is relevant, and he will cite references, Islamic references to this effect, but he builds a philosophy on this. I don't dispute, of course, that any good science that brings good to humanity or to society is good. I don't dispute that at all. But I don't think that this is what science should be about. I think science is about discovery, is about understanding the world around you. Now, what you make of that, how you extract any technology, any application, etc., is a second level, is different. Now, he jumps directly to that second level. He does not stop at the epistemology, at the learning, at the discovery, etc. For him, this is almost an unnecessary step, almost a waste of time. This is where I strongly disagree with him. Islamic principles, again according to him, can help redefine science for all of humanity. So he says we should rebuild science, modern science, as an Islamic science, meaning as a modern science that is infused with the following principles of Islam, and then it can be relevant to the rest of all humanity. Tawheed, divine unity, should be placed at the center. We cannot, he says, or they say, we should not try to develop a science that ignores God or does not search for Him at all. Two, and he uses, sorry for some of the Arabic words here, but these are the sort of Islamic reference terms that they use. Khilafa, meaning human trusteeship of earth, but this also exists, of course, in Christianity, in the Bible, that God put us as regents of earth, as, you know, this is the trust, take care of it, and do good here on earth. Exactly the same, of course, in Islam. And he says, this we need to emphasize and put at the center of our scientific quest. It shouldn't just be, okay, go and discover, and it should certainly not be, as it was in some modern times, nature is greedy and is secretive of its truths. We need to go and torture it in order to extract. And it was stated like this: nature does not deliver its secrets so easily. You need to go and torture it in order to extract. And he said, what do you mean by torture? No, we cannot torture. Nature is our home, is our place, we take care of it, etc. We are not here to torture it to get anything. Knowledge and worship are interlinked, as he says. And then justice and public interest are very important in developing science. So this is the ethical Islamic science that Sardar and his collaborators proposed. Another important viewpoint is Muhammad Abdus Salam, who, as I mentioned, received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his unification of the weak interaction with electromagnetism. Received it in 1979. I remember I was a student then. A very popular figure, very highly respected person throughout the Muslim world. Although there are some issues in the conservative circles because he belongs to the Qadiani branch of Islam, which some conservatives declare it to be a heretical branch. I personally don't care about any of that, but hugely a respectable person I met before he died. And actually he gave some lectures at my university at some point, and I was the translator for him. In any case, devout but rationalist Muslim. This is very important. It's a different viewpoint. He insists that science is universal and only its applications are affected by cultural factors. He says, science is science. There's no such thing as, Islamic science and Jewish science, etc., etc. The applications have to be directed and have to be controlled. They are affected by cultural situations. So some cultures will allow certain things from science and some will not. But the science itself, the discovery, what you learn from nature, etc., has nothing to do with where you're doing it or from what background. He does not believe there are any serious metaphysical, conceptual problems in modern science that warrant a reconstruction. So this is the opposite of what Sardar and Nasser were saying a moment ago. There is no Islamic science, just like there is no Chinese, Indian, Hindu, or Jewish science. This is a quote from him. his detractors have labeled him a conventionalist. They say, okay, of course, he's a typical Western scientist. I mean, what do you expect? He got his PhD from, I think, Imperial College, if I remember, and then went back to Pakistan for a few years, and then found that it was such a disaster. This was in the 60s, I think, early 60s, that he ran back to England for a few years, and then he went to Italy, where in Trieste he established the International Center for Theoretical Physics, and lived there until he died in mid-90s or late 90s. So people say, of course, I mean, he's the product of the West. What do you expect? He's going to tell you that science is Western science, or the way he thinks and the way he proposes things is conventional. He's a modernist. He's a universalist. He's a business-as-usual type of guy. They say, okay, his philosophy is business as usual. Just continue doing science. Nothing wrong. Just go on. But I think this is an important point of view. Now, as we start getting toward the end, I would like to suggest what I think could be a good way of presenting modern science and meshing it or harmonizing it with Islam and perhaps with religion in more general terms. I call this the spirit of Averroes. This is Averroes Ibn Rushd, the person that we highlighted yesterday and talked about for a while. The reason why I call this the spirit of Averroes is to follow up on what we explained yesterday. Averroes, in addition to his rebuttal to Al-Ghazali and in addition to all his commentary on Aristotle, published the book that I mentioned very briefly yesterday, titled The Definitive Discourse on the Harmony Between Philosophy and Religion, meaning philosophy and Islam. And he proposed certain principles on how to put things together so that there is no conflict, so that we don't have to choose one over the other. You become a rationalist and then you give up your religion, or you're a theist, you have high faith, but then you have to sort of forget philosophy or ignore certain things or reject, etc. So what I said in that book is exactly the same principles of how to deal with the scriptures, how to deal with modern science, etc. Same principles that Averroes proposed for harmonizing philosophy with religion can be used today for harmonizing modern science with religion, in particular Islam. Adopt modern science in all its rigorous methodology and results. There is no compromise on this. We're not going to start picking and choosing. We're not going to start rewriting or reinventing the wheel. Modern science is here to stay. Modern science has forced itself as something that cannot be removed or ignored. So anything else is just a waste of time. So we need to adopt modern science. Add an optional, so this is people who don't believe don't have to do this, but those who believe can add this theistic interpretative cloak. So it is at the interpretation level, not at the practice level, not at the basis of the practice of science. It is at the interpretation level you can add your theistic outlook and say, okay, now, so the Big Bang now inspires me to believe in the creation. You can use the word creation instead of the word origin of the world or origin of the cosmos or the universe. And then the emergence of man, for example, from earlier species. You can say that there was infusion of the divine spirit, or you can say there was this jump or this transition, or etc. You can add your theistic language, vocabulary, belief, etc. on that without removing any of the science. So the science is common to everybody, but then you add, if you are a theist, you add this optional interpretative cloak. Universally imposed stringent ethical standards, and as you can see, I put in black here, like those of Islam. So they are universal ethical standards. For us Muslims, we will say like those of Islam, but they don't have to be like those of Islam. I mean, we think that they can be just universal, and in fact, those of Islam can very well be those of Christianity or other. Now, this is for excuse me. This is for Islam and the problems that we encountered earlier regarding evolution and so forth. Accept the Quran's guidance and philosophy of knowledge. This is what I described briefly yesterday. Seek knowledge, go to China, etc. Go roam the earth and try to understand how God originated creation, etc., etc. All that philosophy of knowledge. Make hermeneutics obligatory each time there is an apparent contradiction with modern science. If you change the word modern science here with philosophy or rational truths, as Averroes said, this is verbatim taken from Averroes. So Averroes said, make hermeneutics, meaning an interpretation, reinterpretation of a verse or a statement by the prophet or something, obligatory. Because he was asked, and this is one of the main questions that he addressed, what do we do when there is a contradiction between what philosophy tells us and what religion tells us? By philosophy, of course, they meant then rational, demonstrative approaches to knowledge. When there is something that you know from logic, from math, from astronomy, etc., to be true. And then you read your scriptures and it tells you something apparently different. He said, there is no question. You go to the scripture and you apply hermeneutics. You reinterpret it. Because this is certain, because it's established from the methodology that we have developed. This is only our human understanding, and our human understanding can always be modified. So what I say is we do exactly the same with modern science. Whatever modern science tells us to be absolutely true becomes the reference. And then if we find anything that seems to contradict it, then we have to reinterpret it. Keep in mind the multi-level meanings inherent in the Quran, and I'm sure in the Bible too, or some other scriptures, when reading the verses dealing with natural phenomena. Because some people will come and say, yes, but the Quran says when it talks about the stars that they do this or they do that. And what we tell them is, but the Quran has different layers of meaning, has deliberately, if you look at the language is very often sort of fuzzy and soft and metaphorical and poetic. And so if you are a scholar of astronomy or physics or whatever, and you read it and you say, this I could understand in a different manner, and then somebody else will read this and will say, but to me this is what it applies, remember that it has different levels of meaning. And you can always call upon a different aspect or a different angle of understanding in order to do the hermeneutics that will make the harmony with the modern science results. So this is sort of my harmonizing proposal. Let me summarize and then conclude. Diagnostic first, what we have found by this survey and look at the situation in present-day Muslim world, is that science is low on the, I didn't emphasize the political agenda, but at least in the social realm. It is at best embedded in technology development policies. The problem is when you talk to policymakers and when you talk to educators, and I've dealt with ministries of education, etc., is that science for them, most of the time, if not always, is only good for development. Science is not important in terms of learning, discovery, raising your mind, the arrows that you showed this morning. That to me, of course, is absolutely fundamental. But for them, it's like, yeah, okay, so you're going to improve your human level of understanding of the world. Okay, that's fine, but we need our roads to be improved, or we need, our homes to be better insulated against heat, or something like this. So science funding, science policy, science curricula, etc., are more often than not under applied science, technology-oriented, etc. The nature of science is largely misunderstood. I suspect this is also true elsewhere, many other parts of the world. What is science exactly? What does it do? How does it come to discover things? What are scientific facts? What are scientific theories? What are scientific models? What is a hypothesis? What is peer review? What is repeatability? What is falsifiability? All of this is just, of course, a mystery to most people. So, and all of us need to do a lot hard work on this. Mediocre science education, as I've mentioned briefly. Universities, likewise, most of them neglected for so long. There is widespread mediocrity. I could, as I said, give talks on universities in that part of the world. There's a huge variety, of course. There are some universities that are quite good, actually, at almost the international standard, but very, very few. Most of them, dozens of them throughout the region, are of very mediocre quality in terms of curricula, standards, admissions, management style, promotion, advancement rules, etc. Now, the second part of my conclusions is my recommendations. What do we do to try to remedy to that situation, to try to bridge and harmonize Islam with modern science. We need to go back. We were talking, I don't remember who we were talking about this yesterday, I think it was. Encourage endowments and patronage of science. I think it was at breakfast this morning. This idea in Islam that money is collected through the obligatory charity and alms, etc., and put as endowments for funding, learning, social projects, etc. This existed for a long, long time, for many, many centuries, and was responsible for the development of many of those houses of wisdom that I mentioned yesterday, etc. But for a long time, until maybe a couple of decades ago, completely disappeared as a practice, as a social practice. We need to bring that back to encourage this endowment and patronage of science. We need to set up forums, academies, conferences, etc., to discuss and publicize science. This is what we need to do. Not, the application of science in some specific field, but science in itself, its paradigms, social implications, etc. This is absolutely mandatory. Entice bright minds to go into science for self-satisfaction and contribution at the world humanity level. I encourage my children to learn because I want them to be better human beings and to have contributed something to humanity through their 60 to 80 years of life. Not because they're going to make better salaries or because they're going to be better regarded, etc. This is what we need to work on as educators. That science is important for humans, is important for humans as individuals and as peoples. And this is largely absent. Teach the philosophy of science widely. I put this in red because really I believe that this is the key. Of course, it's easier stated than done how to convince ministries of education to include. There is almost no philosophy of science taught before university level, almost anywhere that I know of in the Arab Muslim world, and even at universities, except maybe in philosophy departments. There is no philosophy of science taught to any science students or to humanities students or anything. They don't know any of that. They've never heard of Thomas Kuhn, they've never heard, of course, of Karl Popper or Paul Feyerabend or any of these guys. To them it's like, who's that? Why should we know about that? Final thought, and I think I'm just about on time. We need to use the lessons I'm trying here to sort of tie in to the previous lecture of yesterday. Use the lessons of the Islamic Golden Age smartly. The adoption of science by the state and the society, the establishment of the freedom of inquiry to a very large extent, embracing the human accomplishments of others without fear or prejudice. Remember yesterday I insisted for a long time that the Islamic civilization took off. It took about 100 or 150 years to take off, because they had to first digest what the Indian and Persian civilization had brought. That was the first contact through Baghdad, and then the Greek Byzantine civilization, and it took 150 years of translation. Then it started to contribute. There was absolutely no worry, no fear in translating all and everything that was found. It wasn't like, oh, this is heretical, let's not even look at it. They translated, read, critiqued, commented on everything, because they had confidence in their own culture. They had no fear. We need to go back. In short, we need to bring back the spirit that produced Ibn al-Haytham, and you remember Ibn al-Haytham. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nidhal, for that really interesting overview. Thanks, and we'll go straight into questions. Yes, please.
I think yesterday you mentioned about Islam science, the history of the past, and today you mentioned about today's relationships. So my question is, what's the main difference between Islam science and modern science in your view?
So the question is, what has changed in the context of Islam and science between yesterday and today? I think two things have changed. Both of them have changed. Islam, probably not Islam as a religion or the principle book, the Quran is still the same, the tradition of the Prophet is exactly the same, but the attitude, the understanding of Islam has changed, and I would say that I'll say a little bit more in a minute. But the other thing that has changed, I believe, and this is what I brought up this morning and discussed yesterday, science has changed. Science used to be this general knowledge and general field of inquiry and exploration, which people did not distinguish from philosophy, did not distinguish from just general knowledge. And you remember yesterday when I was using the word science, I always had knowledge/science. It's knowledge/science. Today, of course, we can't do that. We can't just say knowledge/science. What do you mean? Which knowledge? What science? And that's why this morning I was insisting on modern science, because I think that modern science made a certain jump, certain transformation. So because modern science is different from the old science, it has challenged the Muslims to come to terms with it. This is one. Number two, the Islamic culture has changed. It changed in the following manner. One, the huge decline that I described yesterday, followed by colonialism, led to large, widespread ignorance. So the understanding of humanity's knowledge of today is very much lacking across the board. The understanding of science, what it has done, where it is now, how it functions, even the process of science. As I said, only a few years ago have we started now to have funding agencies. Journals are practically inexistent, although there are some mediocre ones. Societies, science societies, are few and far between. So the whole process is not there. Secondly, for some social, political reasons, coupled with this general decline and ignorance development in the Islamic world, fundamentalism, which is represented by literalism, has surfaced and established itself as the primary social norm or cultural norm in the Muslim culture of today. Most people nowadays will jump to read a verse for you and say, okay, here's what it means. Whereas a long time ago, there were all these exegeses where people were commenting on the verses and associating this knowledge with that knowledge, with previous things, etc. And they were much more open-minded, much more flexible as to what this means and what is acceptable and what is correct and what is not correct. But nowadays, we have, I'm simplifying, because of course it's never monolithic, but by and large there is this culture of literalism, fundamentalism, where this is not allowed, this is not acceptable, and that's why, by the way, somebody asked me yesterday, and I promised to reply with the attitudes with regard to Darwinism. I have a couple of slides on that waiting for you. This is why you will find, as I will show in a moment, when you give me a chance, that 1,000 years ago, people, at least the thinkers, did not have much problem with evolution. In fact, they upheld the ideas of evolution. Not Darwinism, of course. Nobody preceded Darwin, etc. Nobody thought of natural selection. But the idea that species could transform into other species, or that there was a whole chain, etc. All of this existed, and people did not, call each other heretical or did not burn each other and so forth. But nowadays, as I showed, and as I mentioned at lunch today, I have PhD-holding colleagues who will not have anything to do with evolution, who will not accept evolution, period. There are prominent speakers in the Muslim world today who go on TV and say evolution is a fraud, I've heard this word, or evolution is hugely mistaken, there are many flaws in it, and nobody challenges them and say, what flaws? Because it's sort of the social accepted viewpoint. So when they say there are flaws, everybody says, okay, yes, sure. But if I stand up at some conference and say, excuse me, what flaws are you talking about? No, that's not true. Then everybody will start looking at me like, where did you get this guy from? So that's what has changed. Science changed and the Islamic culture changed.
Can I just add one further point, Nidhal, as well? I was down at a Christian-Muslim dialogue in Istanbul just a few weeks ago, organised by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So we were divided into discussion groups, Christian-Muslim groups, and deliberately there was quite a broad spectrum of views, theologies within Christian community and the Islamic community. So we had a discussion, and we were starting using the word science. I mean, the discussion was in English, so we started thinking, well, wait, we better just think here. What do we mean by science? So, and it was interesting because two of the Islamic scholars had completely different views on what it was. So one was saying it's ilim, it's bilim in Turkish, or just taking the Arabic word, in the sense of any body of constructed knowledge. So the way that we would use science and medieval science, a sort of body of constructed knowledge. For the other person who was much more liberal, I think coming more from where Nidhal would be coming from, I mean, bilim is definitely modern science, that's what it is, with that set of methodologies. So even within a group of 7 people, and that group of 3, then Islamic scholars, there are actually 2 quite different views about what science was, and I think that sort of relates to the question as well. I just wanted to add that. Yes, question in the back. So.
I studied communications with emphasis on journalism, and during your talk, you briefly commented on science journalism and the most Muslim word nowadays, right? So my question is, in your opinion, what is the real importance of science journalism, not only in Muslim world, but in general?
I think it's extremely important. I think it's an educational tool, it's an educational field. It sets the tone, it directs people's interests. If you put it on the cover of the newspaper on a weekend, then definitely people will take notice and will read, will write back, will go and ask the next day the professor and say, I read this yesterday. If you bury it in some little paragraph somewhere on page 17, then of course nobody will pay attention to it. It depends on how you present the scientific development, scientific news, who are the references that you call upon. For example, I'll give you an example. When was this? I think it was in September or October when the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, was inaugurated in Geneva, in Switzerland. And it was the biggest accelerator that humans had put together, etc. Unfortunately, there was a breakdown right afterwards, and it has not functioned yet. But that's a footnote. Al Jazeera. On that day, I was sort of following the news, and late afternoon they call me and they say, we're going to have, every day they have a half hour on sort of the item of the day, the main issue of the day, where they invite one person or two people to debate or to discuss it, to bring some highlights. So they called me and they said, we want to discuss the LHC today because we have heard that it has something to do with the Big Bang. It is recreating the Big Bang. You see, so there's this theological perspective, and so we want to see whether that is correct, and can you really recreate the Big Bang? Things like this, you're an astrophysicist, And because we heard also that it might create a black hole and engulf all of us, and you're an astrophysicist, so you can tell us, I'm in danger, you know? It happened that day I had a dinner invitation. So I said, well, I have a dinner invitation and I could possibly talk to you by phone if you really need me, but I will not be able to go to the studio, which is on the other side of town. So they said, okay, we'll get back to you if we need you. Half an hour later they call me back again. They say, we have found somebody, but we still want you to be on, because once they had somebody on the studio, so sort of on the picture it looked good, but they also wanted somebody who is sort of an astrophysicist to participate by phone. And I said, okay, fine. I didn't know who they had invited, who the second person was invited. The reason I'm telling you this story is to tell you it depends on how the journalists are going to present the story, who they're going to refer to, who's going to comment on what, etc. And so I am on the phone and I'm waiting for them. They say, okay, stay on the phone, it's going to start in a few minutes, and and they start by presenting the other person first, and then me. And the other person is probably Dennis knows, Zaghloul al-Najjar, who is the leader nowadays of this scientific content in the Quran. And I'm like, so I participated, and I actually had some dispute with him live on the show, because, and they brought him, the reason why they brought him is because they thought that science, Big Bang, means Quran, religious speaker, somebody who is a scientist, he has PhD in geology, but refers only to the Quran and thinks that most of that science is in the Quran, etc. So they brought him in. I was at least happy that they brought another person, scientist, who's going to present the real science and correct things, etc., etc. But that's how important. Imagine if I had said, I just cannot be there, and if I had not been there, then that whole half hour on that whole topic, on that historic day for science, would have been commented on by just that one angle. So that's how important scientific journalism is.
Thank you. Yes. In the middle and then back. Yes. For you, sir, please. Yes.
The question about you said, I was struck by the fact you say impose universal, stringent ethical standards, and yet at the same time adopt modern science in all its conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
So, one issue seems to me the scope of science.
Mm-hmm.
What is the scope of science, and where does it stop, and where does the ethics begin? So, this whole move towards evolutionary psychology, for instance, is an attempt to understand ethics in its evolutionary. It could be conceived as a way of science taking hold of ethics and bringing it within the scientific methodology. So there is an issue as to the scope of science and to what extent you say this is scientific, this is appropriate for scientific methodology, and at what point you say actually this is now no longer within the scope. This is where we must have an alternative source for our values.
I tend to think that there are no limits to science. I can be proven wrong, or I can be argued against, and I can be convinced that I'm wrong. But so far, I have believed that there is no limits to science whatsoever, including evolutionary psychology, including cognitive science of religion that we heard yesterday. Everything is up for learning. Everything. Ethics and constraints and borders, etc., are only set in applications, in how we're going to use whatever knowledge. So we learned about nuclear energy. Of course, we're not going to stop our learning of nuclear energy just because we could make a bomb out of it. So yes, go ahead, learn everything about nuclear that you can. But now that somebody comes and says, you know what I can do? I can do a bomb for you, and you can really eradicate your enemies. Then I say no. Or any other applications like this, cloning, etc. Go learn, yes. You want to learn how cloning is done? Yes, learn it. Now, are we going to use it? Are we going to use it for humans? Are we going to use it in certain situations and not others, etc.? That's where we put the ethical constraints. But as I said, I'm not dogmatic about this viewpoint.
And I guess on the particular point of evolutionary psychology, you could try and come up with various evolutionary explanations for human behavior or why people do certain things. Sometimes they're not very good explanations, or they don't have very good data behind them, but let's say they were valid. I guess people tend to run into the naturalistic fallacy, don't they? That simply because you can explain why X, Y, or Z was good for human bonding or social life or whatever it might be, and we were just hearing in the Darwin Festival last week how grandmothers are very good, for human evolution. We had 2 talks on grandmothers last week in the Darwin Festival. I was impressed, Now, you could say that doesn't, and actually, especially if grandmothers are living in the house, actually, they're even more beneficial. But you still have to ask the question, ought we to have grandmothers living in the house? So, these ethical things still have to be raised, don't they? We have to get round the naturalistic fallacy of thinking that descriptive science is going to tell us actually what we ought to do. So maybe that's another angle.
Even if we come to understand something fully and for sure, there's still this interpretation and this application and the second level that comes afterwards. So the learning is just the first level. The learning doesn't force you into any direction at all, in my view.
Thank you. There was a question at the back first, I think, and then we'll work for... Yes.
Okay. You mentioned these surveys that show the one that was in the Muslim world that showed the vast majority of people reject evolution, and then even your own survey at your own university showed a similar idea. My question is, do you think that teachers in these more conservative countries, if they were to talk about evolution positively, would they risk losing their jobs or risk losing, is there a real threat to talking about it even positively or as a possibility in these cultures? I mean, is this...
In the conservative countries, it could very well be. The way that would come about is some student will go to the principal, or some student will go to his father, and the father will call a friend at the ministry, and then the ministry will call the director of the school, and you have a teacher there who seems to be saying this and that, and then the teacher would be called in, and what did you teach last week? And it could go that way. It's very possible. It's not... I mean, people are aware of which situations are sort of dangerous, and how far their margin, how large their margin is of statement and maneuver. So they will know. I also want to point out one thing, that there's a huge diversity of attitudes in the Muslim world. You go from, I don't know, from Libya to Egypt, and things change drastically. You go from Saudi Arabia to Bahrain, and it's completely different. You go from Iraq to Iran, and it's completely different. So it's really case by case. But there is the possibility, definitely, that and people are aware. I mean, I'll tell you, when I teach astronomy, I sort of deliberately, surreptitiously start to put in some evolutionary ideas. We get to that how? We get to that, I mean, evolution, biological evolution is not on my curriculum, obviously, but we get to that when we start talking about the evolution of Earth. Okay, so we have the solar system forming, and we have the nebula, and we have the sun at the middle, and then the planetesimals, and the planets and planetoids and so forth. And then the Earth, and it had a primitive or primordial atmosphere, and then there was carbon dioxide that came out, and then the carbon dioxide, because we happen to be in what you will be talking about, I suppose, tomorrow, is it? In the habitable zone, and water is liquid, and then life was able to, at least primitive life was able to appear, and then that produced photosynthesis, and we had oxygen, and then that even allowed life to develop, and then whoa. Somebody will say, where are you taking that? Wait. You're saying that life appeared like a primitive form in the ocean, and then because of oxygen, it developed, and then it crawled out, and so you believe in evolution? So I say, of course, don't you? And then, of course, I see the whole class going, oh. So I get into a discussion with them, and usually it takes me like at least 30 to 60 minutes of, okay, what is evolution exactly? What is wrong with evolution? What is shocking for you? Etc. So there is a margin of discussion, etc. And I have at the end of class some students who come to me and say, I don't know why you were saying those things. Really, I was shocked. So meaning they are still not convinced. And some other students who come to me and say, that point of view, sort of the theistic evolution point of view that I present, is really wonderful. Do you have any references that I could read, any books, etc.? So that's how it goes. The problem is this kind of debate, respectful, enlightened, etc., is very rare. We need another sort of test of faith for us, if you can produce something for the Muslim audience.
Just to add a quick, I know we've got other questions, just to add a quick point. I taught biology in the Muslim world for 15 years, and it was a few years ago, 70s and 80s. I can not remember a single student who ever came up afterwards and objected about the fact I was teaching my biology within an evolutionary biology framework. So I think that now, of course, that's Turkey and Lebanon. Every country is different, but I can't even remember one, actually, not one single one. So I think also some things have changed. And I have a question, because it came up in Turkey a few weeks ago. Now, there's a view in Turkey, all this creationism stuff, we never used to have it. It all is an export from America. Okay, so this is, the view you get. So it's all exported from America. Now, I think there's some truth in that, but I would like to ask you whether you feel how much of that has played a role, actually, and how much is it homegrown? How much is this homegrown creationism, and how much is imported? In your,
I think in Turkey, of course, because of the what is it, the BVM or
the thing that
Adnan
studied.
There is clearly established collaboration between them and between the creationist organizations in the state. So collaboration on creationist literature, creationist arguments, etc., between Turkish creationism, which, of course, really did not exist 20 years ago, or was latent, or was hidden, or was only in the villages or something, has reappeared in force and has used that connection to the American creationism. That is true. But in the rest of the Muslim world, it's completely homegrown. Completely homegrown, there's no question. I mean, when I talk to people, they have never even heard of, what's his name, Morris?
Ken Ham, Henry Morris.
Yeah, Henry Morris, and you know, these people, they have never heard these names, and they don't even know that there is creationism in America. It's all... Since we are on the topic, maybe I should, at least to fulfill my promise of yesterday to some of our friends. Okay, Muslim scholars and evolution. So I've divided into two slides. I prepared this yesterday evening just to be able to answer that question more fully. Muslim scholars and evolution, I've divided into two slides, one from the Golden Age, the past, and one from more modern times, the reception of Darwinism. From the Golden Age, there are a number of scholars, some of them extremely well known, Al-Jahiz, Al-Farabi, Ibn Khaldun, etc., who have written certain things on animals and life and organisms, whether alive or inert, etc. I just want to read a couple of things here, just to show you this is from 1,000 years ago, and this is from six centuries ago. Ibn Khaldun is an extremely well-known and highly respected scholar of sociology, history, etc. Ibn Miskawayh, who wrote, "The end of each species is connected to the beginning of another one, as if by a common thread that ties several threads in a correct arrangement that brings out a uniform and unified yarn." Now, people will say, oh, this is well known. This, even in the Greek era, there used to be this great chain of being, where, of course, we start with the minerals, and then the organic material, and then the plants, and then the animals, etc. But there is no evolution in between. But now, read, for example, what Ibn Khaldun wrote. Ibn Khaldun said, look at the world of creation, how it began from the minerals, then the plants, then animals, in a marvelously gradual way. The connection between these creatures is that the end of the ladder for each one is strangely ready to become the first rung of the next ladder. Indeed, the world of animals extended and multiplied in its species until it reached man, that species endowed with thought and vision by gradual creation, reached from the world of apes that received senses and perception, but did not acquire thought and vision in its action. So this is what apes are. They are these creatures who have sense and perception but do not have thought and vision. That was the start of the ladder of man, and this is what we now witness. So it comes tantalizingly close to saying that there was this transformation. Anyway, modern views, again, because of time limits, etc., I have summarized it very briefly into the following. Nowadays, we can divide thinkers' views on evolution into three. There's the traditionalists who are dominant. Al-Afghani, Sayyid Nasr that I mentioned earlier, Martin Lings, a convert to Islam and mysticism, and many others who reject evolution, claiming that there are errors in it, and they have other non-scientific arguments. Then there are the creationists, like Harun Yahya, who has all kinds of books on this. And then there are the modernists. Now, I want to focus a little bit on the modernists. These are the people who came right after the publication of The Origin of Species of Darwin, 1859. So this is just barely 20, 30 years afterwards, and how they commented and responded. Hussein al-Jisr, who is a Sunni Islamic scholar. So this is not, because some of the other people like Al-Isfahani is Shiite, and so when I bring this to my Muslim friends, they say, oh, but he's Shiite, so it's sort of irrelevant to us. To me, it's not irrelevant. But Al-Jisr is Sunni, is a Muslim traditional scholar. He's not a scientist, a biologist, or somebody who has liberal views or anything. And he wrote in 1887, a book that received an award, that ended up receiving an award from the Sultan, accepting the truths. He said, we need to accept all truths, implying and then stating very clearly that among these truths is the idea of evolution. So this is in a comment on The Origin of Species. He said, because we must accept all truths, we need to accept evolution and even methodological naturalism. This is a sheikh. This is barely 28 years after the publication of Darwin's book. Nidhal Isfahani in 1914 writes a critique of Darwin's theory solely on the status of man. He said, my problem is the status of man, as we heard in several other contexts. Mustafa al-Mansouri and Hassan Hussein, who both are Egyptian thinkers, they're not scholars of Islam or anything, but they're thinkers. They were highly convinced by Darwin's potent theory. They said, this theory is so strong, it's so marvelous, it can explain so many things, this is fantastic. And they said, they tried to show from the Quranic verses how it can be reconciled with religion. So I call them the early Muslim theistic evolutionists. Just to give you an idea of how far back we have gone, how terrible things have become. In 1998, this is more than a century after Hussein al-Jisr had written his book, for which he received an award, there is this Egyptian scholar, again Muslim scholar, who writes a book titled Adam, My Father. In Adam, My Father, he says, I have been thinking and researching this for the past 20 or 30 years. I have come to the conclusion that there is not one Adam, but there are many Adams. In fact, the Adams go back to millions of years ago. I say, oh, fantastic, great. So I read through, and the problem is he has all kinds of conceptual and factual mistakes on the science, one. Two, you end up understanding that he does not accept evolution. All that he says is that Adam is not very recent. And there are many Adams, and they go back a long time. But he says explicitly, but this in no way implies that I am accepting that Adam or my Adams, my ancestors, came from earlier species, etc. Even with this, he was nearly tried and nearly kicked out of his university post. Just because he claimed that Adam goes back a few million years. So that's the situation of today.
I'm sure there's going to be a lot more questions. I'm also aware that a trip is going off to the Darwin papers, and therefore we have to finish on time. This is a great opportunity for people with questions to put them on a piece of paper and to fill up the plastic box, please, on the piano. Get them written down now as soon as you can during this break. Because once John Polkinghorne comes along, you're going to have a lot more questions, I can guarantee after that. So, get your fresh ones down now about all we've heard today. And thanks, Nidhal. That was really fascinating. Thank you very much.